Well, I'm Dr. Carlos Cortés, a retired a professor emeritus of history at the University of California, Riverside, but still working part-time as co-director of the Health Equity Program for the UCR School of Medicine. I've been out working for a number of years and returned to graduate school in 1962 and at the University of New Mexico, and I jointly, at the same time, took a master's in Portuguese and Spanish and a PhD in history. I finished my master's thesis focusing on Brazilian literature, and then continuing on for a PhD in history. Spent 2 years in Brazil doing doctoral dissertation research. Came back, got my first teaching job at the University of California, Riverside, starting in January 1968 as my first job, and I retired. I'm still there, never moved on. Been in the interior for a month doing oral history research with former politicians. Came back to my apartment in Porto Alegre, capital of Brazil, and there was a letter from UCR offering me a position. They said, fill out these forms, send them back. I filled them out, took them down to the post office. You always do that, go to the post office so they can stamp it right there, make sure it doesn't get lost. Sent it back. Suddenly there was another letter that came back, said, you've got a job. Wow. That's the way it worked. I found out later that in fact they had contacted one of my advisors at the University of New Mexico, and I said, you have some good candidates, and one of them said, hey, I think Carlos Cortés he might fit exactly what you need, and they gave him my name. I had never even set up an employment form, employment file. It was just my grades, my records, their letters of recommendation. I never even had an interview. That was the old days. But I mean, remember, this was it was a pre-digital age, and telephone conversations from Brazil were I was there 2 years, and I never talked to anyone in the United States for 2 years. So today people, I got to call home to see if I can go out and get a pair of shoes. No, there I was 2 years on my own, so I just was out of contact with the U.S., which made a big difference, by the way, in the trajectory of lots of things. I went to Brazil in early 1966, came back at the end of 67, and that's when the Vietnam War protests, that's when the beginning of the move for ethnic studies, the civil rights movement. So I was absent. So I was a foreigner looking back and just reading about what was happening in my own country. And I came back and suddenly I was thrust into it when I started at UCR. So that changed my trajectory. There was movement, let's call it that way, starting in mid-60s to have something about ethnicity in the college curriculum, about people who've been left out of the American story. When I got back, there was number one, I was the second Chicano faculty member in the history of UC Riverside. It was a microbiologist. When I got back, he contacted me about the second week I was there. He saw my surname in the list of new hirees. He called me and said, are you Chicano? Well, I was raised in Kansas City, Missouri, and we didn't use that term back there. And I said, well, let's meet. And we had coffee and we talked about it. And he said, if you are, then you've doubled our size here at UCR. I mean, so there I was. The second thing is, the movement for ethnic studies was just beginning, and so our chancellor, Ivan Hinderaker, wanted to get ahead of the game. He didn't want protests like happened at Berkeley and San Francisco State. He said, let's get ahead. And he formed a committee, and I was on it. I'm the second Chicano professor. We had 2 black professors, if you can imagine, 2 black professors, 2 Chicano professors in the entire faculty. And so we met as a committee. And one of the first things we said was we want to go our separate ways. We don't want to have ethnic studies. We want black studies and Chicano studies. And actually it was Mexican American studies. And we went informed, we split the committee, had two different committees, came up with our proposals. They were approved in 1969. Black studies came into existence, Mexican American studies. That was 69 they came into existence. 1972, I became the chair of Chicano Studies. Our former chair left of the Mexican American Studies. One of my first experiences was coming into the office, finding students had taken over my office, or in the office, demanding the name change from Mexican American Studies to Chicano Studies. And I walked in, I said, look, you don't have to demand anything. Just say we'd like to change the name from Mexican, and we'll bring it up at the next meeting. We brought it up at the next meeting. We voted, we decided we wanted the name change, took it to the academic senate, changed the name. I said to the students, you don't have to demand anything, just bring it up. Don't raise the level of rhetoric, just ask, and we did. But that's how transitional things were at that time. Gene Cotarrobles, the microbiologist, and I actually formed what was called UMAS, United Mexican American Students. The next year it became MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Islam. No, we actually there were only 100 Mexican descent students on the entire campus. I mean, today it's 40% of the campus. Then it was 100 people. So we gathered them in a room, and so there are a dozen or so. Said, yeah, the two faculty members, think you ought to form. So it wasn't that grassroots at all. And they had some good leadership, and they formed it, and away it took off. Yeah, these were kids from all over, terrific young people, but they hadn't coalesced yet because they were in a sea. They were in a sea of whiteness, and they were alone. We had about 100 black students, about 100 Chicano students on the entire huge UCR campus. So we kind of brought it together. And then the kids took off. Their leadership was wonderful. Yeah. We always worked closely together. In fact, the black faculty and Chicano faculty said, we can support each other better by being separate. Because we took a look at what was happening in other campuses. And what was happening is they were getting together and they'd do things like this. The administration would say, okay, we got an ethnic studies unit. We'll give you one position. And we'll let you fight about who gets it, blacks, Chicanos. So we saw that. We said, we don't want that fight. So we're going to stay separate. In fact, we decided to go into separate colleges. Chicano Studies was in humanities and the college, and Black Studies was in social sciences. That was on purpose. The four of us would get together and say, strategically, how do we avoid the pitfalls of what's happening elsewhere? We weren't getting online and talking about these things. We were getting together in each other's homes and talking about these things. Yeah, it was because ethnic studies has now been in existence for 50 to 60 years. There was no, at that moment in the siege of war, in the fog of war, you don't know, are you going to exist next week? So we were fighting for existence. So we were saying, what are the best ways to do things so that we can survive, right, and do good stuff at the same time? How did I meet Fernando Worrell? We've talked about this. I don't know. All I know is I get a call from a guy named Fernando Worrell. He'd like to meet with me. We met in my Chicano Studies chair's office at UCR. What prompted that? Could have been two things. At that point, I was already beginning to give workshops, some for teachers, but mainly for teachers, sometimes in the community, about Chicano stuff. I taught the first Chicano history class at UCR, winter 1970. So I was already doing that stuff. Fernando may have attended one of my workshops or presentations. Vice versa, he might have had an idea for a bilingual ed conference, said, who can I get support from? Chicano Studies, a natural thing. And I happened to be the dude in the office the moment he walked in. I mean, I honestly don't know how he first found out about me. But he came, we met, and I was just starting as Chicano Studies chair and was looking for kind of ways to actually do more things. And this seemed like a natural connection to be supported. Because when people said bilingual in those days, it meant English-Spanish. I mean, and it was code for English-Spanish. They weren't talking about Tagalog, and it was an English-Spanish code. So bilingual at that time, okay, Chicano Studies is a logical place. To show how distant it was, I didn't even know there was such a thing in existence as the Riverside County Office of Education until a certain point when I learned it. Now, did I learn that my second week at UCR? Maybe. Was it 5 years into my stay before I learned it? I think it's easy for institutions to operate separately and different. So I'm not sure when. All I know is that I remember, now that you brought it up, in late 1969, we held our first ethnic studies conference for teachers at UCR. It was before Fernando, and I spoke at it, and a couple of people spoke on Black history, it was a day-long conference, and a lot of Inland Empire, and I say that in the broadest sense of the word, came to it. There were probably some Riverside County Office of Education people there. Maybe Fernando came to that. That may have been when we first had our contact. I don't know.
Right.
There was a sense that, okay, the Chicano students had been left behind. The data showed it, dropouts, push-outs, not going to college, you name it. And then there was somebody, I don't know who the first one said, it's because of language. No, somebody had to have the idea first, and languages must be it, or one of the issues. And so if we bring Spanish into the classroom, maybe that'll help. Now we need a label for it, and the label became bilingual education. And it was, if you ask me, where did the name bilingual education start? I don't know. But somebody sitting in a room like this might have come up with it. And then it finally started percolating and people started using it. And the idea was, if we do language stuff, that will help reduce Chicano dropout rates, maybe increase them graduating from high school, going to college, and so on and so forth. And so that's where the UCR conference was, when Fernando met with me, he said, let's do a conference that looks at this issue. Now, if you take a label, bilingual education, there's no expertise in the field because it's new. So what gathered were not experts in that first conference. It was doers. It was people who, bilingual education. I'm a fourth grade teacher. Well, let me try some Spanish putting some signs on the wall. Someone else's science class. And, well, I'm going to find the pictures of a couple of famous Chicano biologists. So different people were trying different things. There was no expertise to go to. So what you got at that conference was sort of a co-exploration. It was people coming and sharing what they were trying, and other people going to the session saying, oh my gosh, that's a good idea. Or I think that, oh, I never thought of that. And all that. So it was very exciting because we were learning on the run. If we weren't deferring to experts, we weren't deferring to models, we weren't deferring to State Department of Education telling what bilingual education was, because it wasn't. It was a grassroots thing. It was being created on the spot. And probably stupid things were being done in the classroom in the name of bilingual education, not because of malintent, but because people were just experimenting. And even things that didn't work, we learned from things that didn't work. And it was the same in ethnic studies. I mean, I taught Chicano history, and every year I changed what I taught because I said, oh, I taught it one way, I've learned some more, I'm going to do it different the next year, and so on. It's not like you had a ton of received knowledge. Now, there was some long history of research on language learning, but that's different. That's a whole different thing. And some of that could be integrated. But who's going to do the integration? See? And these were practitioners, busy teachers who were experimenting with stuff and sharing their experiments. Some people were talking about bilingual, bicultural. Others were talking bilingual. Now, I don't want to make a huge, an absolute divide there, but folks differed on the way to bring culture in. Do we bring in some food? Do we bring in some pictures? Do we put some Chicano art or Mexican art on the wall? Is that the bicultural piece? And others are saying, no, it's a deeper issue than artifacts and things of this sort. And some were saying, no, it's really about the language. So you had experimentation in different directions. Over time, the bicultural kind of fell out, and it disappeared from the language of the conversation about what's taking place. It got more toward the technical of how do we transition kids into be able to function in English, or transition and help them maintain their language. And that was a big split between those who were saying it's all about transitioning kids into English as fast as possible, and others are saying, no, the maintenance and development of their home language in itself is a good thing. And it's a split that still exists because you were learning so much all the time. You almost couldn't go to a session. I go to educational conferences now. I can be bored out of my life. I can go to a session. If I learn one thing in a 2-hour session, I'm saying, wow, that was good. Because I've heard so many things being said over and over. It wasn't that way back then. Mm-hmm. Every time you walked into a session, you knew there's going to be something new because the field was so new. Right. I remember standing up in front and giving the opening welcome to and sort of a semi-keynote, short keynote. Teachers filled the entire UCR cafeteria, a huge cafeteria. There are several hundred people who were there. And the breakout sessions packed, all of them, yeah. Huge, yeah. They couldn't all fit into that, and there were people outside. We had to put out speakers outside for people to hear, because it was so new. And it was all part of a larger thing, which was how tie this with ethnic studies, multicultural education, all that. How do we deal with the fact that some cohorts of people have been left behind in the American journey, or marginalized, or oppressed, depending on how hot language, how you want to use it, but have been left out? And how do we how do we push the needle to, we use the word inclusion now, to include, but not just include, be more equitable about our inclusion. That was the sort of the driving force. Bilingual education was one of those dimensions of trying to create a more inclusive and equitable society. Mm-hmm. And that's what was exciting, because you weren't just talking about teaching, you were talking about social change. Mm-hmm. Well, it's more established, which is good and bad. It's more established. We got more expertise. We got 6 decades of research. But it also it becomes too fixed. Anytime I hear the word best practices, I shudder, because it sounds like we got the best now. Why do we need anything more? You don't say that, but the word best is sort of a closure word. Back then, no one thought about best practices. We were learning new things and trying new things. So what we have there is, what we have today are more established entities, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily more as dynamic today as it was back there, because it's more fixed. We've got state mandates. We got to fill out certain checklists of stuff, testing for when does a child no longer need English language services. It's not a question that was asked back then. We weren't saying, oh, this child has passed a certain, took an oral proficiency thing, they're now no longer services. We didn't know what services were. I mean, they were kids, they spoke Spanish, they're not doing as well in school, we want to help them do it, Maybe we do some Spanish language stuff. So it was less professional in the most negative sense of professional, which means too solidified, too almost autocratic. I'm not saying that everybody in these fields is autocratic today. I'm just saying that the fields have solidified, that I'm not sure if we're getting the kind of wild, imaginative experimentation that was going on back then. I loved those old days. I'm a pretty active guy, but I'm one body, so I don't know what's going on. And experiments were going on behind the doors of a classroom. So I knew people got together, and I knew people exchanged ideas. But what was actually happening in individual classrooms, I don't know. I was, except what a teacher might say. Here's what I did. That's the only way. That's the only access I had to that, and a little bit of research coming out. And that just there were no research programs in this because it was a new idea. Even how to design a study of bilingual education was up in the clouds. Mm-hmm. Conferences went on constantly. That's all I can say. I mean, I just know I'm a kind of a madman. I keep a record of all the places I've spoken at. I do an annual list. I keep a list. I said I still do it to this very day. I sit down and keep this list so I know, I can look back and say, on that date I did this conference. Here's the topic I spoke at this conference. I've got records going back to the late 60s of my own. Stop, full stop. They were just happening, but they were happening on different topics. For example, I was also a part of the National Council for the Social Studies because I'm a historian, and we were doing stuff. All of a sudden they got a grant to do a multi-ethnic principles for the social studies. Notice the term multi-ethnic, not multicultural. We met for 2 years. This task force I was on came up with multi-ethnic principles in the social studies. By the time it was published, multi-ethnic was almost a passé term. Multicultural had taken over because it was said, oh, but what about gender? What about disability? What about religion? What about sexual orientation? These are coming all at one moment, over time. And so the concept of multicultural expanded. And then and what about language? So multicultural education was developing over here, bilingual here. But I, as one who got involved nationally in multicultural education, and that became more my calling card, I kept bringing language in. I said, don't forget the language piece. Don't forget, as a social thing, you can't leave that out of multicultural. They're connected. Right. But a lot of multiculturalists were monolingual, so they didn't, they were a little uneasy with dealing with the language factor because they didn't understand it. Yeah. Let's go to the subtitle, Social and Cultural Factors in the Education of Language Minority Students. Even take the language minority students. Today it's English language learners. So it's the term minority sort of disappeared from, I still use it, but only in a historical sense. So the idea was some people up at the State Department of Education, and they took the leadership and they said, it's more than just language. It's more than, we need to look at more than just language. And nobody was looking at the more than just language within bilingual education. Multicultural education was looking at lots of different stuff, but it wasn't pervading the bilingual education conversation. So they said, let's just bring some people together who are doing some interesting stuff in the larger ethnic and multicultural spheres. Get them together, let them talk, let them write, let them exchange. And we met I don't know how many, Fernando might know, 2, 3, 4 times. We'd meet, people would write articles, we'd get together, we'd read each other's stuff, we would respond to each other's stuff. And they brought about half a dozen or so scholars together who were doing work in different areas.
What are some of the names of those folks again?
John Ogbu, Louis Malle, Esteban Diaz, Mary McRory, Shirley Bryce Heath. People, if you think, say, look at the bilingual education literature, may not appear, okay? But this wasn't bilingual specialists being brought in here. These were people doing work on culture, ethnicity, social structures, all that. Let's bring together and see how that, if we get together, do we come up with some new ideas that might affect the way English language learners are educated? Notice the word bilingual education was not in the title of that book. So it's a broader book than that. And my role as a historian, I had been, when I was now Latin American historian, doing Chicano history, teaching, getting into multicultural education, and I was trying to figure out a research agenda. My background was in communications. My BA was in communication, mass communication. I had my MA was in journalism, MS was in journalism. I'd worked as a working journalist for 5 years. So I asked the question, how does all of this, the media aspects, affect the trajectory of ethnicity? And I came up with I wrote I think an article was, I think it was in the journal Educational Leadership. It was a think piece, and it was called a School Curriculum and Societal Curriculum, Allies or Antagonists. And I came up with the concept societal curriculum. And what I argued in this was teachers are not education. They're just part of the education process. They've got a whole other thing, the societal curriculum: home, families, churches, experiences, and media. And I did my focus on how have the mass media affected the way that we think about issues of diversity. I started with ethnicity and diversity. And I worked on this for about 25 years. It really culminated with a book in the year 2000 called The Children Are Watching, How the Media Teach About Diversity. Notice, the media teach about diversity. I didn't look at how do the media teach about ethnic groups, about religion, about how do they engage the idea of diversity. It was a stupidly mad, it was a mad question. It was so huge. But because I pulled it together, I was the first person to do this, and no one's ever tried to do it since. It sort of put another step in my reputation. Okay, dial back. So I'm in these meetings with these others, John Ogbu talking about oppositional culture, Louis Malle talking about funds of knowledge. We're sitting around, a dozen of us sitting around, going all day, having these fabulous conversations. And I thought to myself, maybe where I can contribute is to look at the societal curriculum and the school curriculum and how that plays out in the education of language minority students. And that's when I came up with this thing they called, which is in the book, the first chapter, the contextual interaction model. That was my little sitting there as people talk, putting down squares and arrows and saying, taking my little article I'd done in educational leadership and applying it to language minority students. And I came up with this complex model, which in fact I looked at it last night. Again, unreadable. I mean, it's got so much stuff in it. But I think the dynamics of the model worked. And so if you get past all the junk and the weeds, it says, let's think about this in a larger social sense. So that's what they asked me to do the opening chapters. But take what everyone else is writing their chapters and sort of fit it into a model that makes some sense so that teachers can look at that and say, yeah, there are these complexities. And ironically, I'm still every year, so I get an invitation to come and talk about my contextual interaction model. That's 40 years ago. I'm not even sure I still believe it, but I think it has a lasting quality because it's based on the premise that teachers do not monopolize education. We're in a struggle with external forces, and you see that taking place in school districts right now. Now it's talking about parental participation, but that tension is always going to be there, and it's a good tension. I had so many invitations to come and talk about my model, which was really an extract from what everyone else is doing. Yeah, I think, and by the way, there's a very interesting piece about Peace Corps people. I'm involved in another project right now. It's called the Intercultural Legacy Project. And it's a group of interculturalists from all over, from about a dozen of us, who are doing a composite story of the whole intercultural piece, Peace Corps being part of it, but only part of it. I'm coming at it from a multicultural education perspective. Others, and we're each doing a kind of a little memoir piece, about 20 pages, about how our work in the intercultural, not multicultural, intercultural field has affected stuff in different ways. So this is, we're talking the synergy of these different fields, and the State Department folks brought that piece in. But it was all tied together by the one thing is we want to help people who've been left behind or marginalized or left out. It's much better to be lucky than to be smart. So timing happens. My book, Children Are Watching, came out in January of 2000, or February, it was right at the beginning. I was invited, by that time I was retired from UCR, and I was a full-time lecture consultant. And I was invited to be one of the keynote speakers at a national conference on Chicano youth, or Latino youth it may have been, I'm not sure. And it was broken up into topics, half day for 3-day conference, half day for each topic. One of them was media. They asked me to be and on the panel, response panel, after I finished my keynote, was a young lady named Dolly Espinal, who got up and talked about this new children's program called Dora the Explorer. And she gave a little presentation about it. And then afterwards we were chatting. Up comes this redheaded guy from New York, who turns out to be the executive producer, Chris Gifford, of Dora, sitting in the audience. He said, "Will you have lunch with us?" And we sat down and we started talking about it. And what had happened was that Chris had come up with this idea for a new show. He and a couple of Valerie and a couple of others had come up with this show called Benjamin the Bunny. And it was a bunny who was going to go out and do all kinds of mysteries and adventures. And one of the vice presidents at Nickelodeon had gone to a Chicana conference or a Latina conference. And one of the complaints she heard is, we have no one in TV we can identify with. She came back to Chris and said, Benjamin the Bunny is out. We want it to be a Latina as your hero. Well, the team that had come up with Benjamin the Bunny, there was no Latino amongst them. So they got Dolly Espinal in, and they were just beginning to put together a team of advisors. When Chris was in the audience, when my book came out and I gave the talk, we had lunch, and he said, Carlos, would you come back to New York so we can talk about it? My plate was so loaded, I was so arrogant at the moment. I said, well, why don't you read my book? And if you like my book, and I sort of was dismissive. And it turns out they bought about a dozen copies. The whole hierarchy of Nickelodeon read it and liked it. They flew me back. I had an interview. The very first moment that we sat in a room, a group of us around the table, the producers. I'm sitting there. They said, well, here's some of the characters we have now. And they put up there a sloth, a sloth who's sleeping throughout the. He's the only Spanish-speaking character. And I'm saying, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You want to be a culturally sensitive program. The only Spanish-speaking, monolingual Spanish-speaking is sleeping. I mean, it fits into the stereotype, the sleeping Mexican under a nopal cactus. You couldn't have the worst stereotype I've ever seen. I thought they were going to kick me out of the meeting at that moment. My career at Nickelodeon was over with. But one of the vice presidents said, the sloth is out. So it became Tico. Instead of the sloth, we ended up with Tico, the squirrel. But so you sort of went at things. We had people. Then they got a team of advisors. Those meetings were like the beyond language. We had a group of us in the room arguing with each other about how Dora should be, how she should be presented, and blah 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 blah. And it was anyway. Make a long story short, I stayed on. I was part of the team of advisors, and then they promoted me to being. They said we got to come up with a title for you, Carlos. So they came up with creative/cultural advisor. It doesn't mean anything. It just was the term. But it was neat to see my name up on the screen at the end of every show. And but those. It was like the beyond language. Those meetings were so fascinating because everyone was talking about how do we make a better show, but also how do we make a show that ennobles kids and ennobles particularly Latinos, particularly Latinas. Okay, and so that was the subcurrent that went within the founding of ethnic studies, the founding of bilingual education was still there. We want to do a show that moves the needles. She personified, but there was a debate over, one of the debates, and here's we go to the bilingual piece. A number of the consultants said we want to have all the characters be bilingual so that you get lots of English and Spanish flowing. I took the absolute contrarian view. I said, no. If everybody's bilingual, then nobody's special. And I said, let's make almost all the characters monolingual. And Dora stands out because she's bilingual, so that she becomes, and I give the term they adopted, to make her the cross-cultural bridge builder and cross-cultural problem solver. And you notice in the Dora shows, that's when they bring the kids in the living room shouting out, responding. This is all my idea. I said, look, but they're helping Dora because you've got all these people trapped in their monolingualism, including Tico, the Spanish-speaking turtle, including Boots, and said, make Dora special. You can't make Dora special if everybody's bilingual. And the hierarchy of Dora and Nickelodeon bought my argument. And later on, they made other programs in other languages using that same argument. And not just for Latinos. See, this is so another argument was some of the consultants said, we've got to establish her as Mexican or Puerto Rican or Cuban and all that. I took the opposite view. I said, no, make her a protean figure. She's Latina. Don't identify her with one culture. Let the families in the home, Colombian family or an Ecuadorian family or a Mexican family, say, she's one of us. Let the families do that. Let them. She doesn't have to be puro anything. She's and I would talk at conferences and at school districts, and they would have Latino parents there, and you'd have Latino parents of different backgrounds saying, she's one of. They would say it there. Our kids would say she's one of us, and they made her what they wanted to make her. And so I fought for things that went against the grain of most of the other consultants, which is why I ended up being the final cultural consultant when all the others either quit or dropped as consultant. Because I had a vision, for better or for worse, of what I thought Dora could be. And to go along with that, I would go to focus groups with parents, their reactions. And what Dora did not only encourage Latino families to keep Spanish alive in the homes, it encouraged other families of other languages to keep it alive. We had parents of different language backgrounds saying, Dora, speaking Spanish, encourage my kids to want to keep our language alive. Kids who were resistant, I'm in America now, resistant to learning their own languages. So Dora had an impact that went well beyond Spanish into the larger question of being bilingual. She ennobled bilingualism. And although we don't have any absolute data on this, all kinds of testimonials came back to Nickelodeon of parents who said, in a school district saying, we've got a boom in dual immersion demand because of Dora. English speaking, and from people who were in dual immersion programs that weren't Spanish. Remember, when bilingual education started, it was coded, it was really Spanish. It expanded out. And now, and when you got dual immersion in multiple languages, it ennobled the whole concept that it's better to know 2 languages than 1, or 3 than 2. So, which is a really important. It's very different than here in America, speak English. No, it's nice to speak other things too. The Dora was a small staff that did a Herculean job in putting together this marvelous program, and they just didn't have time to go. They just didn't have. They weren't a research operation. There have been other scholars who have done research on Dora, but the data collection takes a lot of time. And these were doers putting out a good program, not people studying. Well, that's why you notice her voice, her mouth doesn't move English or Spanish. It moves. One of the things you watch an international film, you see it's English dubbed, and their mouth is moving Spanish or French or whatever, and you can spot the disjoint. In Dora's case, everything is disjointed. She's just moving her mouth up and down like that. She's not mouthing English, mouthing Spanish. So therefore, she can operate internationally. Once it's made, it can be dubbed internationally any way. Yeah. Be purposeful. What I find in almost all fields, it's this way, but in those related to bilingual education, multicultural ethnic studies, what's your purpose in doing it? And for example, let's take bilingual education. Is your purpose to transit kids into English as your target purpose as fast as possible? Or is it to do something else and to see dual language programs say, yes, our purpose is something other than getting kids in English? Well, I think that kind of purposeful question needs to be used in ethnic studies and multicultural education. Yeah. And I'm finding an absence of discussion of purpose, which is bothersome to me. There's so much doing and so much, here's the best practices, here's structures, here's frameworks. The question of why is not being asked as much. It's not, and if you bring that purpose question in, then it gives you the flexibility to grow, and maybe your purpose changes over time. And the beyond language was purposeful. How do we improve the education of language minority students? That was the purpose. We had a purpose that drove us. Purpose doesn't seem to be discussed now as much as I like. I'm involved in the ethnic studies in the state of California, and I keep asking the purpose. When I meet with people, what's the purpose question? Why are you doing it? Other than compliance. I mean, if it's just to check a box, comply with the state, there's no purpose there except to comply with the state. What are you doing it for? Yeah. So let's take it back to the door. I get a script. I'm sitting in Riverside. Scripts come to me. That's how we worked. I did most of my work from Riverside. I'd go to Burbank. They're Nickelodeon studios, and now and then I go back to New York. It's called First Day of School, and Boots and Tico were going to go to school, and Boots all excited about going. Tico's scared to death because if he's going to, Tico speaks Spanish. What is it going to be like to go to school? I don't speak Spanish. I threw a fit. I said, "You're making Tico the fall guy. Tico is, you're making him the dumb one. Boots is going to save Tico because Boots speaks English." And I said, well, what do we do about it? I said, make it a dual immersion school. Make it a dual immersion school. So both Boots and Tico are concerned about it. And they can go on their adventures going to school. Dora's taking them to school. both nervous, and rightfully so, because it's going to be a new experience. They're going to get there. And then in the school, show dual language. And in fact, when they get to school, they have about 5 or 10 minutes in a dual language, dual immersion school. That was my idea. I said, let's do, and they brought in some consultants on what a good dual immersion school looks like. But you keep moving and say, but the purpose was, once again, to make Dora the problem solver, and don't make Tico the fall guy for all this, but make them, he's participating in a larger human experience of going into a new kind of school. And that's a good thing. And kids then of all backgrounds can identify with that. So if you ask the purpose question constantly, it helps you to sort of shred certain things. We don't really need to do this, and do other things, and make choices that are more purposeful in terms of accomplishing something. The Dora team, they couldn't be better. They're still my, even though I'm not working in Dora at this moment, they're still my and Dora and Diego, because we did Dora, we did Go Diego Go, we did Dora and Friends Into the City. We had a series of shows. And it's people, if you're working with people, say, we want to do the best for kids and for the better social milieu we're in by being more inclusive and equitable. Then you have purpose in what you're doing, and you're willing to go the extra mile and be willing to jettison some stuff that wasn't really helping you with your purpose. So that's what I would say is the discussions of purpose are not as much as I'm in education. Too much compliance. Purpose is hard. I mean, I've been at it for 55 years as a social activist this way. It's hard to keep it going. And compliance is easier. You get a checklist. Have you done this? Have you filled out the forms? Did they pass this? It's just much easier. The bureaucratic mentality, you can sleep at night. Purpose is you drive, because you should never be satisfied. See, no, we can do better next time. Tomorrow we'll do better. And actually, it's what keeps me going, why I'm still involved in ethnic studies, still involved in multicultural education, and in an odd way with bilingual education, although I don't consider myself a bilingual education practitioner. I'm a participant in the trajectory. Having an organization as we exist, to keep the term out there at an organization, so that, if nothing else, if it never met, if it never had a conference, just having the title would be good. So, but let's go beyond that. It also gives us sustainability. The hard thing about making change is sustainable change. And CABE provides sustainment, and also provides ideas. Now I don't go to every CABE conference. When you go to a CABE conference, I go to sessions. I look at some sessions. Oh, that's a topic I've never been exposed to. I mean, 3/4 of the topics I've heard and heard and heard and heard. But there's some new things. And that's why I say, but with a new purpose, I say, let's. I don't look for the technical ones. I look for the ones that are more visionary to go to. So CABE provides vision and ideas and practices, not necessarily best practice, but pioneering practices so it serves a whole series, I think, of contributions. So the field is much better off having CABE. And the field might not even exist. If CABE didn't exist, bilingual education could have been swallowed up into something else. And education is good about swallowing this thing and swallowing it up into something else. And CABE helps keep that alive. Keep pushing for greater inclusion and equity. It seems to me that to pair it up with excellence. You can have equity without excellence, and everybody loses. Now, I worked in health equity. We could make we can make medicine much worse and say everybody's now equitable now, getting worse medicine. That has everybody loses. But to have equity and inclusivity connected with increased dispersal of excellence so that everyone benefits from it. And if we think in those terms, then we have a purpose for what we're doing. And that keep the purpose alive, make compliance sort of a secondary dimension of what you're doing. Is the ultimate. The ultimate is are the kids better? Do they have better futures? And when they individually have better futures, do we as a collective have a better future? I happen to believe in those that we are better individually if we are also better collectively. So that would be so much sort of thing I would say to educators over the 50-year span. And I think that pursuit, which can never be fully achieved, that pursuit as a goal is I think, critical. I think it's very helpful. And it also helps to look at what you're doing today and say, oh my gosh, those are our roots. Maybe we've lost out on some, maybe in the doing, we've forsaken some of the stuff that got us going. I'm one of the few people in the United States who has sort of been involved with bilingual education, multicultural, ethnic studies, media studies. I don't think there's anyone else in the country. It was just, and I just took an insane path. I'm able to feel comfortable integrating and bouncing around. I mean, I hadn't done anything in bilingual education in years. I feel very comfortable talking about bilingual education. Education is changing so dramatically. As I follow my 6 grandkids, 3 are college graduates, 3 are still in college, and my wife who's just a conduit to all of them constantly. Education, the trajectories are so different today. I know, I may have told you, one of my granddaughters started her own business when she was a freshman, and she has a side business designing characters for Dungeons and Dragons, for the video game, and whenever she has 3,500 followers who want her to do characters for them. She just can't do it. So, but what she does is she'll say, I feel like going on a weekend they took off and did a weekend in Utah. They went to Bryce Canyon and Zion and all that. A bunch of her friends, I need the money. She just goes online, puts on to her followers, she says, I'm available to design 5 characters. The first 5 people who deposit money in my account. It's PayPal or one of those. She goes to the bathroom. She comes back. She's already got the money in her bank account, and she sits down and does the characters for these 5 people. I can fit 24/7 designing characters. But it would be, she can't make any money that way because how much can she charge? And so it comes out like minimum wage. So instead of working for Del Taco, she sits at her but it's a new world of kids' careers